All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. I'm covering for Jason Elton this morning, who normally runs the Techie Breakie. So my name is Ryan Clemmer, Director of Trade Partnerships here. We've got about 6 or 7 people that are online with us today for the class. We've got Dave McLaughlin from OSHA and Lisa Pickert from Neil Kelly. And so this morning we'll start off with David, just kind of leading us through some of the requirements here, and then Lisa is going to take us through what you've done to develop a program within Neil Kelly. So hopefully this is beneficial for everyone. Part of my job leading off this morning is just to talk just for a second about the partnership between the Home Performance Guild and Inhabit. Don McCodrum, the executive director of the guild, wasn't able to be here this morning. So the plug today is there's a guild meeting this afternoon. If you haven't attended the guild meeting, it's a great place to network and meet other contractors working in the same space as you. So this afternoon at the Kennedy School, you can attend one of their meetings if you would like. So please do if you can. So without further ado, David, the floor is all yours. Welcome. Thanks. Yeah, there's video. If you stand over here, we'll actually record and then we'll post this afterwards. So perfect. You're perfect.
So good morning. My name's Dave McLaughlin. I'm with Oregon OSHA.
Nobody's thrown things yet.
And I noticed there is fruit, so I'm a little concerned. I've been with Oregon OSHA for almost 25 years now. I used to be a compliance officer, and then I got better. I'm with the standards and appeals section. I keep changing the name. I can never keep up. Basically, I'm in the section where we're the folks that write the rules you love to hate or hate to love. We do rule interpretations. We revise rules. We do what we call our program directives, which is the instructions to our field staff about how to approach different situations. We do interpretations. We do what we call fact sheets, and I actually have some of the stack of fact sheets about this particular issue. All of this is available on our website, which is www.osha.org. Don't go to OSHA.gov if you can help it, because that's really confusing. Because that gives you the federal folks, and some of the stuff that's applicable in Oregon won't be there, and their website sucks. So confined spaces. Back in the early 90s, federal OSHA came out with this rule on permit required confined spaces. That only applied to people that did not apply to construction activities. That applied to what we call maintenance or general industry. So where that's applicable to you guys is a construction company comes in and does work. They didn't have a rule that really told them gave them all of this stuff of what they had to do. You came in to do an inspection beforehand or afterwards. You weren't doing construction work, so this rule actually has applied all along because you weren't actually doing the construction work itself. So realistically, this is not something particularly new, but what happened a few years ago is federal OSHA when they came out with the confined space rule, they started working on a rule for construction. And then 20-something years later, they said, hey, we're done. And they came out with their proposed rule, and we looked at it and said, okay, we think we can probably do better than this. We went to our construction folks and showed them what federal OSHA had done, and they said, yeah, we think we could probably do something better than this. So we revised our rule, but a lot of stuff didn't really change. But how we said it did, plus we had this new applicability to construction activity. Construction versus maintenance can be kind of confusing. So we have a set of rules that are specific to construction. And that applies to if you're building something new, basically doing something to the structure of a building. If you're replacing something with something new, or you're knocking something down. If you're doing maintenance work, or you're replacing, say, like replacing a gutter with the same thing as if the old one was crappy and needed to be replaced. That's considered maintenance. If the house didn't have a gutter and you put one up, that's construction. It gets a little confusing, but there's from a macro satellite view, it's a bright line. When you get really close, sometimes it gets muddied up because there are places where you can cross that line and not really understand that you did, and it can get very confusing sometimes. But overall, the two are kind of easier to figure out which one's which. One of the problems that we have with confined spaces, particularly, or construction versus maintenance, is one day you go in to do an inspection, the next day you go in to do work, the day after that you go to see if your work actually did what it was supposed to do. Only one of those days were you doing actual construction activity. The other 2 days you were doing maintenance activities, or would fall under general industry. So if we had 2 different rules that said 2 different things, which one do you follow? Yeah, pick one and hope it works. Or pick the one that has the less stuff to do, right? And that's usually the wrong one. So what we did when we were working with our stakeholders is we said, let's have one rule for everybody, so it doesn't matter what kind of activity you're doing. And it seems like it's working. I mean, there's some stuff that's specific to construction activity. There's some stuff that's specific to fixed industries. But overall, it's pretty much the same thing. So let's talk about confined spaces, which is kind of what I'm here for, right? What is a confined space? Confined space is defined by having 3 very specific characteristics. All 3 have to be present. If any one is not there, it's not a confined space. So those 3 characteristics: it's large enough to bodily enter and do work. So 55-gallon drum, while you could stuff a freshman in there and sometimes it might be funny, probably isn't big enough that you could actually get in and do work. So just because you can squeeze into it doesn't mean that it's a confined space. You actually have to be able to get your whole body in and do work. The second piece is it has a limitation on how you get in and out. So this could be how you get into the space, how you get out of the space, or how you maneuver within the space. I was in one place that it was a fairly large space. You got in with a fixed ship's ladder, which is technically a fixed staircase, so that's not a limitation. But moving in and around, there were pipes everywhere, and you had to weave and wind around all these pipes. Aha, there's your limitation. So it can be. It doesn't have to be just because you have to crawl in, or just because you have to crawl in and out. That's the only limitation. It can be the internal configuration. A good rule of thumb for that is if you have to contort your body or use your hands, you're probably dealing with a limitation. Another piece of that is thinking about if somebody goes in there and they go down for any reason, how difficult is it going to be to get that person out? If it's just a matter of pulling them out, that's not a limitation. But if it's going to take a team of people to coordinate and figure out how to move them from here to here to here to there and then get them out, that's probably a limitation. The third piece of confined space is it's not designed for continuous occupancy. This can be confusing to folks because some spaces are designed for periodic occupancy, but that's not the same thing. What's the purpose of the space? What's it for? Actually, attic spaces is a great example. Normally, an attic space is not designed for people to be there. But sometimes people will go in and finish their attic and turn it into another bedroom or another living room or an office or something, if they're lucky enough to have an attic big enough to do that. They've changed the purpose of that space, so they've taken it out of that piece that now it's designed for continuous occupancy. That's what it's for now. So other spaces, like I said, they can be designed for periodic occupancy. So if you have a fixed staircase going in, or you have lights and you have some kind of ventilation. Um, is that designed for continuous occupancy? Not necessarily, because that could also be true of a New York City sewer, which, unless you're a chud or a mutant turtle, is not designed for you to be there. Those three pieces are what defines a confined space. So we have a confined space. So what? Is that a problem in and of itself? No. An empty swimming pool is technically a confined space. What we're concerned about is a fourth component. Once all three of those pieces are there, then the question has to be asked, is there a hazard? And is the hazard serious enough that it's going to cause problems, kill you, or do extremely bad things to you in the short term? So what we're talking about is an acute hazard, not something that's chronic. So if there's asbestos, if there's silica, these are not things that would make us a confined space a permit required one. For people doing attic insulation, if it's fiberglass and they have to wear a respirator because of the fiberglass that they're blowing in, that's not a hazard for confined space purposes. That doesn't mean it's not a hazard. That doesn't mean that they don't have to address it, but they don't have to use the confined space rule to address it. There's other ways.
Because it's not an acute hazard.
It's not an acute hazard. Like I said, asbestos and silica, they will kill you, but they'll take 20 or 30 years to do it. Okay. We're concerned with the stuff that's going to kill you in the next 30 minutes or next couple of days. That's what the confined space is about, because essentially if somebody goes in and they go down, actually, what this rule looks at is, first off, how do you address the hazards before somebody goes in, and then what do you do if something goes wrong? The reason why is, for many, many, many years, at least 60% of the people that die in confined spaces are would-be rescuers. So more than half of the people that die are somebody who wasn't actually in there, supposed to be in there in the first place. The other thing with this rule is it's with confined spaces. We're pretty hard on on making sure that all of these things are in place, because so many people die in confined spaces. Most of the time, if something goes wrong with, say, personal protective equipment, it could end up in the emergency room. If something goes wrong in a confined space, it ends up in the ward. And that's just the reality. So when you have that happen,
Can you give an example of an acute hazard that might exist in a crawl space or an attic?
actually, I can give you a couple. So heat can be a big one. So that somebody goes in, it goes down inside a space. It's, say, 100 degrees outside, and they're in that space at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You know it's hotter in there than it is outside, and so that there are some things you have to think about before you do that. It can also be something that you bring with you. If somebody is inside a space that's applying, say, a flammable coating, and you have the potential for both a toxic and an explosive atmosphere. For crawl spaces under a house, say out in the middle of the country, rattlesnakes. Other things that you can have, if you have standing water, if you have a broken sewer pipe, you have sewer gas, and also potential for explosive atmosphere. If you have standing water and mold and stuff growing inside, you have potential for an oxygen deficient atmosphere. So when we're looking at these things, we're looking at, again, the acute hazards, stuff that's going to affect you in the here and now, stuff that's going to inhibit your ability to get yourself out. For attics and crawl spaces, most of the time, absent the heat issue, do you see these kinds of hazards? Probably not. I mean, if it's reasonably clean and dry, you're not really dealing with a hazardous atmosphere. You're not dealing with any physical hazards. If everything is as it's supposed to be, you're probably not dealing with a confined space, or what the permit required confined space. It's still a confined one, but it's probably not a permit required one. But again, there are also hazards that people can introduce. I was talking to one of our consultants. We still don't know why this is. You guys might know. Apparently, with whatever they were using for the insulation, they had to heat the space up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit.
What?
Yeah. I don't get it. I don't understand. That may have been lost in translation somewhere, but that was the question that was asked of me. So what happens to water at 212 degrees? It boils. What are we made out of? Water. That's bad. And then when they have folks that go in and do the application, they have the big guy inside with all the equipment on who's doing the application, and they got the 90-pound kid outside, and their plan is the 90-pound kid is going to go in there and carry that big guy out. They ever test that?
Yeah.
How's that going to work? It probably isn't. When we talk about confined spaces, let's just presume it's a permit-required confined space. There's very specific things that have to happen. First, you have to essentially figure out what are all the hazards. You need to identify what are the actual and the potential hazards. Potential hazards are those that you can say that you can reasonably anticipate. So we're not talking about the hazard of, okay, well, if the moon of Mercury hits an asteroid just right and it sends it towards the Earth, you could be crushed. Not really a reasonably anticipatable hazard. But I'm going into a crawl space and the sewer pipe is gushing out stuff. I have a reasonably anticipatable hazard. Does not mean that it actually exists at that moment in time, but I've identified it as a problem. I need to evaluate it. I need to make sure that it doesn't affect me if I still have to go in there. So there's the identification and evaluation. And then there's a decision point. Are we going to go in and do this work, or are we going to wait or hire this particular piece out and make that problem go away? So for heat, which can be a seasonal issue, crawl spaces are usually 10 or 20 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature.
It can be up to 30.
So they can be even hotter.
Yeah, especially attics. Full sun.
Right. So yeah. I mean, so you've identified that if it's 100 degrees outside, it's probably at least 120, 130, maybe even 150 inside. Got to deal with that. So if somebody's going to go in there and do work, first of all, they have to be able to understand the hazards of what they're dealing with. And you have to have somebody that can keep an eye on them, an attendant. They have to understand what the hazards that person's exposed to, and it essentially is that person's eyes, ears, and lifeline. You have to have somebody that's going to do the evaluation of the space, evaluation of the work, evaluation of the control measures in place, and authorize that work. So you have somebody who's essentially supervising. Now that supervisor can also be the person inside or the person keeping an eye on the guy inside. And then you have to have a plan in place that you've practiced to get that person out in case anything goes wrong. So you have to have provisions for rescue. A lot of times if people are going down a straight hole, it's real easy to get them out because you have them up to a tripod and you just kick on the tripod and you crank them out. Easy peasy. If they're going horizontally into a space, that won't work. So what's the plan? How are you going to get them out? That attendant does not go into that space. for any reason, unless there's a new attendant. So there's always eyes and ears on the outside. So if there's an attendant and that person goes down, that attendant has to know, I'm not going in there. We have this rescue plan. We've practiced it. We know it works. I'm initiating it, whatever that looks like. For these guys, it may actually involve having some other people come and pull them out. But even with rescue people, with the rescue team, if they're going inside, they're entering a permit required confined space too. So they have to have all of this stuff in place to figure out how they're going to go and do the work. So this gets real complicated real fast, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be. So let's say you have heat as an issue. Okay, so how do you deal with that? What's the best and easiest way to deal with that problem?
Do your work in the morning.
Do your work in the morning. Blow out that attic space before you go in and do that work. If you go in at 6, if you put a blower in at 6 in the morning and let it run for half an hour, what's going to happen to all that heat inside that attic space? It's probably gone, right? Is it going to come back in the next, say, 2 hours? No, it can't. So basically what you've done is you've taken a confined space, a condition existed that made it a permit required confined space, you've eliminated that hazard, and right now it's no longer a permit required confined space because there's no way that this is going to return for the duration of the work. You don't have to do anything else. That hazard's been completely eliminated. You can reevaluate that space and say, there are no hazards present. We go in, we do our work. It's just a confined space. Just like if we were going in and doing this work in December, right? So that's one option. Sometimes people are using isocyanates for a foam, like a 2-part foam that they're spraying, and they have to wear a respirator. Does the presence of that nasty stuff in the foam make that space a permit required confined space?
Yeah, there's some fumes there, so it could be toxic.
Could be toxic. Here's the thing: it's a chronic hazard, not really an acute one. So that particular piece, they're in a respirator, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're in a permit required confined space. It's not necessarily a permit space hazard. It's a chronic hazard. Now, if it's a flammable liquid that they're spraying, that's also part of that. That's the permit space hazard. Because blowing up is really unsafe. There are also, depending on the hazard. So let's say you have a crawl space with a breached sewer pipe. So you know that there's a potential hazard. You could potentially go into that space without a full-blown permit program, because we have this other piece, this other option that's called alternate entry. So where you have physical hazards that you've temporarily eliminated, so like if you had moving machinery and you lock it out and you tag it out, that can't come back on. Or you have pipes that terminate inside that space and you double block and bleed, so that it's blocked on this side, blocked on that side, and then there's a bleed spot, so if something goes wrong here, it's still not coming in because it's going out that way. These are considered temporarily eliminating the hazards. Or if you have atmospheric hazards that you can adequately control with continuous ventilation, and you have continuous monitoring to back that up, you can go into the alternate entry process. Some of it's similar to how you would go into a permit, or how you would do it with a permit required or permit space program. But there are a few differences. First of all, in order to enter a permit required confined space under a permit space program, you have to have a written program that describes the whole how you do everything. The alternate entry requires procedures, does not require a written program. Depending on the complexity, it might not be a bad idea, but you don't absolutely positively have to have it. Permit program requires an attendant, an entry supervisor, and provisions for rescue. Alternate entry does not require any of those. What it does require is the person who's inside has a means of communicating with the outside world. And that's it. That could be a radio, that could be a cell phone, that could be, they have a helper, they're in voice communication, they could be 2 tin cans and a length of string. Under the permit space rules, if you're with a permit space program, you have to have a written permit where you've documented where you are, what the hazards are, what you did about it, how you know that worked, who's the attendant, who's the entrant, who's the entry supervisor, who's rescue, all this stuff. Alternate entry, there's a lot of that is still there. So who you are, where you are, what were the hazards, what did you do about it, how do you know that worked? That's basically the stuff you're documenting. It's your pre-flight checklist. Just make sure that you've identified and accounted for all the hazards, and you've done something, and you know that you've done it. You positively know that you've done something about those hazards. If somebody asks you, "What did you do about this?" and you say, "I did this," and you say, "How do you know that worked?" "I don't know." You're not done. That's pretty much kind of what confined space in a nutshell looks like. Like I said, I did bring some fact sheets that we put together specifically for attics and crawl spaces and dealing with you guys, and what your guys are dealing with. And we talked about a lot of this stuff. This, like I said, this is also on our website, or OSHA.org. There's an A to Z topics list on the menu. Go to that, go to confined spaces. Everything we have about confined spaces is right there, including this fact sheet, another fact sheet on confined spaces. We have a booklet that we put together that kind of tries to explain better what the rule says. I wrote the rules, so I like to think that I wrote it in a way that people can figure out what the heck they're supposed to do just by reading the rule. That was my goal. Because if you've ever looked at the federal OSHA one, I still don't know what you're supposed to do. And then I got some cards. And if you want to put my contact info up, so
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll make sure that I link all of that. I'll take the document that you have and turn that into a PDF as well, and we'll
actually you could just link that directly
Okay.
from our website.
Perfect. And that's what we'll do.
PDF.
Yeah, we'll link it directly to their phone.
And the
phone.
PDF is even prettier because it's in color. We're not allowed to print in color. So, questions?
I want to open up any questions online too. You all are muted right now, but you can use IM to ask any questions, and I can unmute you. So if there are questions online, please feel free to ask them. Just type in the IM or the chat section of GoToMeeting. Any questions here?
Is that just not flowing yet?
I don't have any online right now as well, so we can transition then. And Lisa, it's all yours. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me. David, thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm gonna obviously hang out when she's
Great.
talking, so
Please do.
it does come up.
You should be able to advance slides with that now. Just push to the right and. It's all you.
You're gonna get my power. Oh, I can do it?
Yeah, you should
There
be.
we go.
Oops.
Okay.
There you go.
There we go.
Yep.
Okay. I suspect after I get done, you'll have lots of questions, because if your experience is anything like mine, as I began to grapple with what Dave has written, it becomes pretty overwhelming. So what we decided we wanted to offer today is the practical side as well as the policies and OSHA regulations. So I'm going to offer the practical side. And my goal is really to make it easier for you guys, and I'm willing to share all of our documents that I've developed so that you don't have to recreate the wheel, because it's pretty overwhelming and time-consuming to do so. So a bit about who I am. I work for Neil Kelly. I was a project manager for 4 years in home performance. So I know about sending my crew into tiny crawl spaces. I took pride in having the smallest person in the company fit into little spaces, and I would send her in there by herself, and now I have a lot of guilt about that. But she survived and still working for us. But so I know what we're dealing with, attics and crawl spaces as far as confined spaces. I've also been a small business owner. I had my own company for a little while. I was a tile setter, and so I know what it means to not even pay attention to any of these regulations. You're just doing your business. And I know we have some small companies. Even I want to recognize that, because since Neil Kelly is a large company, we of course have to pay attention to this a little bit more. We're a little more vulnerable than a lot of you. So I'm going to show you what probably is overkill for many of you. But I want you to see the big picture, and then you can figure out how to tailor it and make it practical and feasible for your company. And now I'm the safety coordinator. I changed jobs last September. I'm the safety coordinator for the company. So I have to think about this all the time. And a lot of the terminology that Dave used is something I've become familiar with. But if you go to that website, even Oregon OSHA, it's not simple. It's confusing. And I want to simplify it and make it quick and easy, accessible. So that's what I'm going to try to do. So I'm going to go through all my slides. And I encourage Dave, I'm glad you're staying, because I think that, well, two things I want to say. One, Dave's been really helpful to me. So one of the things I've learned is that OSHA, while they can come in and fine you, they're also very helpful. And I've drafted a program, and Dave hasn't heard the whole program. I've called him with questions. But Dave, as I lay it all out, I'm hoping you're going to give me feedback at the end of the day or sometime over the next few days about our program. What is correct? Maybe there's things that aren't correct. But this is my trial and error that I've developed around confined spaces. So with that, I'll move on. Okay, so what I'm going to cover is setting up your own program, sort of my trips and slips on it, but also what I've accomplished. I'm going to specifically talk about the training that you need to do, talking about establishing your own policies and procedures. I'm going to show you the equipment that we're probably going to use, haven't yet purchased, but we're getting close, and talk a little more about procedures. And then, of course, I want to leave a lot of time for questions, because I think there will be questions. Because if it's anything like my own experience and several of my colleagues here from Neil Kelly, as you start to hear about this, the questions just go wild. I mean, there's a lot of implications to these new regulations that it's like, how the heck are we going to do this? So, on with the show. Okay, the resources, though, that are available to you. There's a couple of, for those of you involved with Efficiency First, if you're a member, they've got a couple of great videos. They did webinars on this topic that'll give you some background information. So be sure and check out those, and those are online. AGC, for those of you that are connected with AGC, Association of General Contractors, they're our advisor on safety issues. Now, I don't know how many smaller companies use AGC, but that's an advisor available to us, and they have a great website. You can go on their website and access a lot of information. So it's agc.com. It's a great resource to me, and I think you could get a lot off their website. Your workers' comp provider, if you do provide workers' comp, if you're big enough to have that for your employees, SAFE is our workers' comp carrier. They have a lot of good safety information. And then finally, as Dave said, the Oregon OSHA website. And for those of you in Washington, of course, it's Washington L&I, and their website, they too have an A to Z listing, so you can use that. They're a great, that website's very well laid out as well. So those are all resources to you and resources I've used. Okay, what else? So developing our policies. So again, what I had to start with is kind of figuring out what is the policy, distilling down what OSHA has written. And the main thing, as Dave pointed out, is that anybody entering a confined space has to be trained and has to follow the procedures. Let me back up and say I've trained, I don't know, probably 100 people at our company now on this whole issue of confined spaces. And I want to give you a context. As an employer, as a company owner, this can be overwhelming and feel like it's just a lot taking you away from the core focus of your business, doing work, getting paid for it, right? But I want to tell you, after training probably over 50 or so field personnel, every time, here's my audience. When I train project managers and other administrators, they all whine about it. When I train the carpenters who are out there in those crawl spaces and attics, they're like, yeah. Okay? So think about that. They like that somebody's paying attention to this issue, thinking about how we might make these spaces safer to enter. They appreciated all the training I did, so I just offer you that as a perspective when it gets overwhelming. There are some really good nuggets about these new policies that will serve us all well. And as another context, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but just last week, last Thursday to be exact, a guy died in a trench accident in Portland, 20-something years old, confined space, little trench down there. They did have it, what's the word? What's the
Shored.
Shored, thank you. They did have it shored, but he walked outside of the shored space and the trench collapsed and he was killed. This was over in the Southwest. So it's real. And if you don't train not to go out of that shored space, accidents can happen. So the training is really important. Okay. The training also helps you get your head in the game about all this. And again, I can be a resource, Dave, and all the other resources are great. Okay. Developing policy. Let's see. As Dave mentioned, so we've got definitions. Confined space. He talked about the 3 qualities of confined space. Limited entry, hard to get out of, and what am I missing, Dave? Limited and what's that?
Hazard.
Limited entry, hard to get out of, and not continuous occupancy. Those are the 3 spaces. Those are
Come
the.
on, you guys. I just talked about that. I'm very disappointed.
So that's the definition of confined spaces. We know for us it's crawl spaces and attics, and then you get into this, which Dave alluded to. He talked about alternate entry, and he talked about a permit required space. There's also a non-permit, and this, again, the language starts to get confusing. I'll try to simplify it, but this is all the things I had to deal with in setting up our policies and procedures. Okay.
Just point of clarification.
Yes.
So if you look at the federal OSHA rules, you look at the Washington rules, you have a confined space, confined spaces are permit required confined space, non-permit required confined space, and then you have permit required confined spaces that you can reclassify as non-permit required confined spaces. We took a look at all of that and we said, okay, you know what? Let's break that down into 2. You have a confined space or you have a permit required one. So really, how I would say this is under confined spaces, you have one no hazards, and then under confined or permit required, either enter with permit or alternate entry, depending on the circumstances.
And for our Washington audience, I don't know if that's exactly the same, nor does Dave, because his specialty is Oregon. So you would need to check your regulations in Washington, because for those of you that don't work with OSHA much, what Oregon and Washington has established is their own entity of OSHA, and they have to match the federal regulations or go higher, make it more restrictive. So we have to pay attention to both levels. Really, the easiest is to pay attention to the state levels for Washington and Oregon. And I don't know what I haven't dealt with the Washington regulations yet. I've just been focused on Oregon. So, okay, going to try to move on. And again, I know it'll start getting a little overwhelming. We'll have plenty of time for questions. Okay. What I want to say here is you do have to develop some procedures, and I'm going to show you those that I've developed. Again, I want you to tailor them for your own company, what's practical and feasible. But what I really focused on is how to fit the procedures in with the natural flow of things, okay? You can't implement something that's going to be more cumbersome, and it is in itself, but I tried to go with the flow of what we're already doing and make it as quick and easy as possible. You'll see that with some of my forms, and then also get a lot of input from the end users. So as I've been training the employees at our company, I've said, what you're seeing is a draft. Let's keep going. Let's revise it. And I've revised it and revised it and revised it. Okay, so now here's the first form I'm going to show you. So Dave talked about you either have a permit space or alternate entry or a non-permit space. One of the things that's confusing is, okay, one, determining that, and two, what still do you have to do? What kind of documentation do you have to have? Now, this is where Dave's going to help me. If I've done overkill, he's going to tell me you don't need to do that, and I'd love to hear that. But what I've tried to do is meet this letter of the law, so what I'm going to lay out for you is that. Okay, this is the form I created. Those resources I gave you have lots of other forms that look similar, but I tried to tailor this for the home performance industry, or in residential remodeling, what we in this room do. Okay, so I tried to make it simple. The first thing you have to do when you, okay, I'm going to back up. Any confined space that meets that definition that those three pieces, you technically can no longer enter that space, and by entering it means the plane of the opening. You can no longer enter that space without doing an assessment to figure out how risky that is. What are the hazards in there? Okay? This form is my attempt to document that assessment. So that's why I call it hazard assessment form. Okay, as Dave said, you have to identify the job. For our purposes, I identified who sold the job, who's our auditor from HP Home Performance, and who's our project manager. Who are the supervisors that are dealing with this space and then ultimately responsible for this space. The first thing you have to do in that confined space is test the atmosphere. So, what I've created, and further, but for our purposes, I'll narrow it down for you. You had to figure out what are the risks in confined spaces for our industry, for our particular niche of the industry. So, after a lot of review and research, for those of us in what we do, you've got O2, carbon dioxide, monoxide. Thank you. I'm not a chemist. Flunked the class. Okay, carbon monoxide. LEL stands for lower explosive level. At what level will something catch on fire or explode? H2S, hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide comes from decaying carcasses. Those raccoons we find in the crawl spaces or attics, the dead birds, the dead rats. Those, as he said earlier, decay. They eat up oxygen. If you don't have ventilation in there, you could have a void of oxygen in there. A void of oxygen means you go in, at first you feel really good and you're kind of buzzed because the lack of oxygen will kind of ramp you up at first, then you go down. So it's a little confusing. But the last atmospheric risk is, that was oxygen. O2 is oxygen. You guys weren't helping me out on my chemistry.
Yeah,
We've got oxygen levels, which need to be between 19.5 and 23%. 23.5%, that's the safe level of oxygen. Then we've got lower explosive level, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon monoxide. Okay, those are the things we need to test for. How are we going to test for them? Well, we're buying equipment to do that. Now, everyone's going to need to test for that. You're going to get to figure out how you're going to do that. Here's how we're doing it at Neil Kelly. We're buying new testing equipment, atmospheric testing equipment. And you take this in and you fasten this probe to it. And you go into that, you're at the attic door up there in the ceiling for the attic. You stick this in the attic and you get a reading in about 2.5 minutes. Okay? That tests the atmosphere. Okay? As I understand the regulations, it's not okay just to have a monitor on you because that's not testing the atmosphere. Is that correct, Dave?
Yeah, if you have that potential for a hazardous atmosphere. Putting a monitor on you only tells you why you just died.
So, so first thing you have to do, the first person into the confined space, in our case, the auditors who are going in there to do the initial survey of the house, they need to test for the atmosphere. So they need to take a reading off of that instrument in 2 minutes, record the reading in these boxes, date it, tell me where I am in the house. Because as we know, there could be 3 side attics, 4 side attics, a top attic, and a crawl space, right? So this form needs to be done for every confined space. Was there a question?
Oh, who makes that and what's that called?
Yes, I think I have it in my slides, but this one that we're probably going to go with is with ISF. There's a slide, and I can get you that information. There's several makers of this equipment. They're not cheap. These run the piece of the this piece itself is about $800 to $900 or $700 to $1,000. And then you've got to have supporting equipment. You've got to have a charging station. You've got to calibrate these on a regular basis. Generally, I would say the ballpark figure for the setup for this is about $1,200.
We do have our Bacharachs that we use all the time.
Yes,
So,
and that
doesn't
that-
get all that. But it
I'm
gets
glad
some
you
of
brought
it.
that up. The Baccarat that which the auditors have been using forever and which was required by BPI, those are the BPI standards. Those don't meet the letter of the law for confined spaces. That's the issue. That equipment isn't enough for the regulations on confined spaces.
What is the Baccarat test?
It's a combustion analyzer.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's only really looking at one thing.
Exactly.
It looks at O2 and CO and carbon dioxide and
Temperature.
So
So it
go to
goes-
hydrogen sulfide. I don't know. If you tell me we can use those,
Well, it's really based on the nature of the potential hazards. I mean, if you're always finding dead animals in these spaces, then you have to count for that. If there's no way that an animal could be in there, you don't necessarily have to test for that. But that's what the letter of the rule says, which if you want to be fully compliant with the rule, you're on the same level as the people that ran the Titanic and built the U-boat. Because those were also fully compliant.
What you're telling us.
yeah. So what he's telling us is that we probably need to get some new equipment to test for these areas. The good news is I can tell you this is what you need to test for. You don't need to do that research, and you may need this equipment to do so.
There are
Okay.
multiple vendors
Yes.
and multiple suppliers for four-way gas meters. Also very important if you're using it when you're using a four-way gas meter, keep an eye on the calibration gas because that expires. And when that expires, you can't use that anymore and you need another bottle. Also, with four-way gas meters, you want to make sure that you are testing it you're pump testing it every day you plan on using it.
So what David's talking about is the maintenance and the ongoing maintenance for this equipment. He talked about bump testing and calibrating. With the Baccarat, I know we had to send that in and sometimes it's gone for 2 weeks while you send it in. What we're purchasing with this equipment is a docking station that calibrates, that you still have to bump test it, but it calibrates once you stick it back in the docking station. So it goes out on the job, you use it, comes back in, sits in the docking station, and the docking station will do that.
And a lot of the docking stations will actually do everything for you. You just take it and go.
Yes.
You don't have to do anything else. Others, you might have to do it manually, so pay attention to what you're looking at.
I was trying to simplify, as we all know, that simpler and easier for everybody to use, the better. So trying to make this simple. So back to my form of steps you have to go through with these confined spaces. So we've done the atmospheric testing. We stuck the probe in, we tested it, got a reading, recorded it, recorded the location. It was site at 2, and we're done with atmospheric testing. Then what I did with this form is make a checklist. After a lot of discussion with our crew, I said, what are the things we usually run into in these spaces? Okay, so I'm just going to make a checklist of the typical things we run into, and then yes or no, do we have an atmospheric issue? Up here, did your tester indicate any problems with the air quality? Now, in addition, that atmospheric might also be dust, right? Or fiberglass in the air because it's the attic. So there may be additional things here, but do you have an issue? And then write out a description, okay? All the other categories, things we run into, asbestos, fiberglass, electrical issues, something we run into all the time. Up in an attic, you got open junction boxes, open splices, same in the crawl space. We see those. I've sent my crew in around those. We're going to try to minimize that hazard. We're going to try to eliminate that hazard. So here's a checklist. I'm trying to make it easy for my auditors to go in and just indicate what are the issues we have in those spaces. All right? They're going to fill out column 2, or this yes and no column. Okay. Then they're going to give me a description of what that hazard is. They're just going to spell it out real quick. What again, atmospheric. The attic is, full of dust, and the fiberglass is, you can taste it the second you get in there. You're starting to cough. Description. Then you're going to talk, I need somebody, that person that assesses that space, to talk about what are we going to do about that. So, either we're going to try to eliminate it or use PPE to try to eliminate it from our bodies. Okay? So, in other words, you're going to talk about what are you going to do to, Dave spoke about heat. You're going to run a fan in there. So, this column would have, where are we? Temperature. Here you're going to run a fan, pull the air out, go in, not any work in there after noon, and perhaps you're going to wear a cooling collar, one of those things you can get wet and keep yourself cool. What other PPE equipment, personal protection equipment, can we give our employees so that they're safe and the hazard is eliminated or isolated? Okay? Yesterday I was on a job site, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. One of the crew just came out of the attic. He took off his Tyvek suit, which is a great thing to wear in an attic. He was sweating like crazy, and he probably shouldn't have been in there, and he should have had somebody at the attic opening there with him or some means of communication that if he passed out because it was so hot, somebody could have helped him. In fact, the other 2 crew members were on the roof, so they may not have known if he went down, right? Yes, Dave.
That's actually a great other point. When you're dealing with heat, it's not only the ambient temperature and humidity, but it's also is there PPE that's actually exacerbating that problem. So if you're wearing Tyvek, now you basically have your own little steam chamber inside this hot space, which is going to be even worse. So that has to be taken into account.
Okay, back to my form of steps you need to do. So you've described the hazard. You've talked about how you're going to eliminate it. I've actually adjusted this form. This isn't my latest one. And then if you can remove that hazard totally, if you can get it out of there, if you can fix that junction box, get an electrician in there and put wire nuts on the splice and put it in a box and cover it, then you've eliminated it. But you want to document that it's done. You want the initials of who did it, and you want to document that's completed, okay? You'll notice I had color-coded this. The reason I color-coded this is because red, you got to stop. If you can't get rid of the hazard, you're in a permit space, okay? I can't think of a crawl space or attic where we probably can't temporarily get rid of the hazard. So I think for all of us here in this room, we're mostly looking at what's called alternate entry or non-permit confined space, meaning less paperwork. And what Dave alluded to earlier, if you didn't hear, with a permit space, and I'll get into this, I'll review it in just a second. A permit space, as I always told all of our employees, you don't want to go there because that means you're stationing one person at the entry while the other person does the work. 2 people, twice the cost, etc. Okay, so we're going to try to avoid permit space. So that's why I coded this. Red, that's permit. You're going to stop. You've got to do more paperwork. I'll show you that in a second. Yellow means caution. We've seen some hazards. We've described them here. Like there are some dead rats in there. Okay, we're either going to try to get rid of those or, but it's right here. We're in this space. Yellow, caution, and then can we get rid of it? The green is if we get rid of all the hazards, then we don't have to do anything more. You're good to go, okay? So, checklist. Maybe you have a slightly different checklist you want to develop, but that's ours. We're going to start with. If we don't like it, we're going to tweak it after we start using the form and, make it as easy and quick as possible to do, all right? Here's the back side of the form. After you've done that whole hazard assessment of the space, somebody needs to sign for that. You need to, as I understand the regulations, you have to document that because if you don't and they come asking questions, OSHA, at some point, you better have your butt covered and have some documentation is the way I read the regulations. So I'm going to require this for all our confined spaces. Documenting who was in there, who did the assessment. Then they're going to circle whether you're good to go, green. Again, the column on the front side, green, you're good to go, hazards are eliminated. Yellow, you've got hazards, but you're going to do some things like PPE, cooling vests, like ventilation, like safety glasses, like hearing protection when you're running rotohammers on the walls in that crawl space, right? You're going to describe those and you're going to circle alternate entry because we can temporarily eliminate or minimize those hazards. Or they're going to circle red because there's some hazard that you can't get rid of and we have to do more paperwork. Don't want to go there. Yes, Dave?
Very important clarification. Personal protective equipment does not eliminate a hazard.
And as I understood it, and this is the kind of discussion I want because these are the calls I've been making to Dave. As I thought I heard you say, Dave, eliminate is defined in the regulations as temporarily isolating.
Well, right, but isolation is where you do a physical means to remove the hazard. Personal protective equipment protects you from the hazard, but that only controls your exposure to it. It doesn't eliminate the hazard at the source.
So PPE would not qualify as temporarily eliminating.
Correct. But now, so if you're dealing with heat as an issue, let's say, and you're able to blow it out, and you know that that heat has been removed, you can still go in with the cooling collar to make sure that to maintain that person, but the environmental hazard would not be present, so you wouldn't actually be in alternate entry mode. You're just in regular confined space.
Because you've removed the hazard.
You remove the hazard, but you're doing additional things for that person. That's not necessarily the exposure. That's basically controlling their own temperature too.
Yes.
And then something you said earlier, so several of the hazards on your list, fiberglass, asbestos, noise typically, those are not acute hazards? Is that my understanding?
The asbestos and fiberglass are not acute hazards.
Yep.
Noise can be.
Yeah.
That's always been listed as a potential thing or something that can make a confined space a permit one. I've really actually haven't had any luck finding anyone that could adequately explain when that would actually happen.
Okay.
We don't want to discount it completely, but it would be an extremely rare set of circumstances for noise to be an acute hazard that would make a confined space a permit required one.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, to reiterate your question and for clarification for me as I draft our policies and procedures, Dave, you're saying that asbestos and fiberglass are not acute hazards, so we actually don't need to list those as a hazard?
Well, you wouldn't have to, for confined space purposes, you wouldn't have to identify those. For employee exposure issues, you do want to know if that's there and how that. So, for just identifying hazards, this would be a great tool. But understand that not everything in here would invoke the confined space rule or the permit space stuff. But it's still something you're going to want to know in your initial assessment, initial size up.
Okay. Great. Thanks. Okay, so I was on the back side of this form. So you've circled one of those that determines where you go next. If you have an atmospheric issue, say you've got for some reason you've got carbon monoxide in there, you need to figure out what you're going to do, and you have to then probably indicate that because you can't figure it out, you may have to continually, when you're working in that space, ventilate it. And if the person who's doing the hazards indicates that we need to continuously ventilate it, then you need to record those results. So you have to have either that monitor, which I showed earlier, your atmospheric monitor, or, well, no, you'd have to have the atmospheric monitor in that space to continually monitor results and record that, have that information. Last but not least, what we're going to do with this form is post this at the entry of every confined space. It's a great educational tool. It tells the person going in there all the risks that are in there, all the hazards, okay? Then they're going to sign off that they've been in there, that they've read. It says, I've read it, I've read the information on this sheet, and I understand I can ask questions or I can raise concerns at any time. that language is very intentional. It's very in line with what OSHA requires. They want you to train people, and and that's it's a different regulation, but they want all employees to know they can refuse to do something if it feels unsafe. So I've documented it here. They're going to sign off on this. Posted at every entry to an attic, side attic, crawl space, and I'm going to collect these so that I have an ongoing audit of what's happening out there in the field. And our employees who go into these spaces have an ongoing sheet of information that says, what are the risks in this space? And reminder, I should put on that Tyvek suit, or I know it doesn't eliminate, but we've already listed some things they can do, and that it triggers everyone involved. Oh, there's equipment I might want to give my employees before they go into that space. Really great educational tool. That's how I like to see this piece. A lot more paperwork, but there's some really positive things coming out of this to protect our workers. So that's the hazard assessment form. Any questions about that before I go on? Yes, Rose.
How frequently is this being done, and how long is it applicable? So the auditor goes in and does this. Is it still applicable when I come back to do the work?
Yeah,
a month later.
Great question. How long? The person goes in and does his hazard assessment in April, but we don't do the job until July. That's a reality for all of us in this business. So what I've said, again, this language is intentional for that purpose. We're going to document the hazards, but if anybody feels like, we did I noticed up here, they did this back in December, but now we're in there in the summer. If somebody wants to ask to do it again, we'll do it again. There's no definition by OSHA regulations of how short can be the duration between the assessment and the actual work. So there's nothing written in stone, but it's about, is that correct, Dave?
Yes and no.
Clear as a bell. Yes and no.
If something has changed, you need to reevaluate. So if you assessed in December and now it's July, has anything changed?
Well, it's Oregon. It kind of depends on the day. It could be
Right.
the same exact temperature of storm.
I mean,
It's the
has
Northwest, it depends on the day.
if something within that space has changed.
Like a rat died.
Yeah.
The demise.
Right. And sometimes those are unanticipated changes. Like now there is a rat in there. It wasn't in there in December, but now it's in there. Or vice versa. We did it in the summer, and now it is burrowing in there in the winter. So you have to use your judgment. Great question, and we struggled with this. But I think the key is just think about and let your employees have the ability to question, hey, maybe we should do this again. Okay, so procedures. So we talked about a lot of this. This is just our procedures that I've written. Trained entry employer. So for someone to do that assessment form I just showed you, you got to train them on how to do that. I'm in the middle of doing that for all of our employees. Let me say a little bit more about that. The challenge for each of us is to figure out who does need to know this information. Who do I need to train? At our company, we started out thinking the auditors would be the first in, so I'll just train them. But the more we thought about it, two things. One, in another division, auditors aren't the always one. In our remodeling division, we don't use auditors. So it's a carpenter that's the first one in. So a carpenter, I'm training all the carpenters to do this assessment form. Okay? Another audience is, as I began to train everyone on this, is we realized, there might be financial implications of these hazards. So, crawl space has a broken sewer line. Our salesperson now needs to go back to the homeowner and say, oh, homeowner, you have a broken sewer line. We just discovered that. You need to fix that first. We can either do it for you or you can hire somebody else, and then we can go into that space. That's a financial question. The salesperson's going to want to get involved. I'm now training the salespeople on this whole program so that they're aware, because it's going to get pushed back to them and they don't want to be caught unaware. Okay, so think about who might be implicated or what are the ramifications of this that they might need to know. Okay, that was about training. Really important. For us, the employer whose employees are entering this space is the person that needs to do that hazard assessment. So for us, usually it's our Neil Kelly employees that are going to go into that crawl space or attic, but sometimes in our remodeling division, it may only be an electrician that needs to go in there. If that's the case, we can tell our trade contractor, okay, electrical company, you do the hazard assessment. I want to see that documentation. You do the paperwork for your employees. We don't have to do it. So there may be many instances where you can push this over to your trade contractors. Also means I have to train those trade contractors a little bit. I've got more education I need to do. I'm pushing out policy to them to say, this is what we're going to expect of you when you go into that space. If we're not going in there, you're going to have to do the paperwork. Okay? So important. It can save you some work. There's lots of times when we're not going into a space in our remodeling division, we can pass it off to somebody else. But for home performance, it's usually us, right? Okay. Procedures. We talked about atmospheric hazards. Again, determining your hazards, and there's where I emphasize the retesting. And we already talked about that, but I think that's an important point. Okay. Again, make your own checklist. If you don't, you're welcome. I'll have my cards here. You're welcome to get my checklist, but tailor it to what you do. Make it easy and quick for your employees to fill out, right? Can't be spending a lot of time on this. Post the hazard form. That's the best way I see as I read the regulations to meet the letter of the law, is posting that outside the entries so that everybody can read it. Maybe you'll have to post it in Spanish. I don't know who your employees are, but they need to be able to read and understand what they're going into. I think that's a good thing. So that's just a reminder about how we're helping keep our employees safe. And then everybody needs to be trained about this whole process that goes into those spaces. Okay? In our company, it's the project manager. Oh, I see I have a typo. Project manager, the salesperson, or as I mentioned a second ago, it might be a carpenter who's responsible. That supervisor. I should take off here the carpenter. Our carpenters don't have supervisory responsibility. In our company, a project manager or the salesperson is the controlling contractor. And whether or not we do the hazard assessment form, we still have responsibility as that general contractor like you to ensure that these steps are getting done. So this was a reminder to my own employees that, okay, maybe the electrician's doing it, but you better be sure that they've done that paperwork. Okay? Non-permit space. I think it's going to be a rare instance where it's a totally non-permit space, just a confined space as we defined it earlier. I think that's unlikely. I think generally, and from my reading and understanding of the regulations, we're looking at alternate entry. That language that OSHA uses to define that middle ground between permit space, where you have to have a second person standing at the door, communicating, watching, monitoring what's going on in the space, and a non-permit space. Alternate entry is that middle ground where you've documented the hazards, you're doing some things to temporarily eliminate the hazards like the ventilation, and it's an alternate entry. So you don't have someone standing at the door when your crew is in that space. So non-permit, I think it's unlikely. I think we're in the alternate entry generally for our industry, home performance. Alternate entry definitely includes the atmospheric monitoring, using that equipment. The form is posted. It's posted for the duration of the project, and then it's taken down. I'm going to print those on cardstock, and then they take them down when the project's done. Has to be up there the whole time you're working on the project. Take it down. I'm going to collect those to do my OSHA requirements, which is auditing the overall program. And if a new hazard, like Dave said, new hazards might mean you come back to a permit, or you just have to reevaluate if there's new hazards, or if somebody questions or is concerned about potential new hazards. This is something I ran into in the regulations, and I want to bring it to everybody's attention. lockout, tagout. Everybody familiar with what that means, lockout, tagout? Okay, lockout, tagout is that if you have an electrical issue, you have, in our world, bath fans. Okay, your carpenter is working replacing the bath fan. Lockout, tagout would mean that they've gone to the panel, they've turned off the breaker, they've somehow secured the panel, maybe with a zip tie, and they tagged it, that it has a little sign on it, or maybe a piece of tape that says, do not turn on. Because I think the reality for us is carpenter's up there working in the bathroom with the power turned off, but homeowner has a power problem in some other part of the house. They go down to the panel, start flipping breakers, could turn on that fan where the person's working. So, lockout, tagout means you have to do both those steps. You have to tag it out, identify what you've turned off, and you have to lock the panel in some way. You get to define locking it. I'll leave that to you, but that's what it requires. You can't just say, you just can't put up a sign that says, oh, don't turn on the breaker. That's just the regulation, something I've run into, wanted to bring it to your attention. Okay, permit. I'm going to spend a few minutes because Dave didn't talk too much about this, but I think it's important to, if anything, just scare you into doing the earlier steps so that you never go here. And I don't think we'll need to. But permit, again, there's additional requirements for and roles and responsibilities. At least 2 people. So you've got the person going into the crawl space and you've got the person at the crawl space door. Have we ever done that? Rarely in our company, but maybe some of you have. But oftentimes we're sending somebody in there by themselves. Now we need to, if it's a permit space, we need to have 2 people there, right? Okay, here's my permit form. I've developed it. As I tell my employees, I hope we never use this. But again, you have to identify the job, the address, the location, why you're in there, the dates that you're going to be in there. Do you have signage in place? Hopefully that assessment form, so that people know, oh, there's something going on in here. I need to pay attention. You have to define how the communication is going to work. As Dave pointed out, it can be a radio, it can be your phone, it can be 2 cans on a string. But if you're in a permit space, you have to define that right here. You have to talk about self-rescue, and that's something the regulations are really clear about, is that they don't want you relying on outside rescue, because oftentimes, well, 1, maybe they can't get there, but 2, they're not equipped to get you out of spaces. And as we pointed out, our horizontal spaces, crawl spaces, are a different beast than a drop into a sewer line, right? So you've got to come up with your own self-rescue procedures of how you're going to get that person out of there. I don't know, maybe, it's tricky in our spaces, crawl spaces. What are you going to do, put a rope around their waist and try to pull them out? I don't know. But if nothing else, just think about it. It forces us to think about how you're going to get someone out in a hurry. We had an incident recently at the company a few months ago where employee went into a crawl space, was trying to do his job, worked his way farther and farther into that narrower sloping space, typical of crawl spaces, and he literally got stuck under a pipe as he tried to go under it. Freaked him out, panicked. Luckily he got out and all was good. But that's the kind of thing that these regulations are trying to address. Let's not set up our employees to panic, to get injured, to risk further injury. With the permit form, you have to sign off on it. You have to have everybody sign this. So this is a form in addition to that other sheet of paper. And then you have to identify your services for rescue. I'm asking them to post that during the project duration and then send me the form after they're done so I can monitor what's going on out there. Okay. As you can see, there's a lot of steps. Got to figure out how to train everybody on those, both the policy, the new regulations, but also on the procedures. Who's going to do this testing? Who's going to fill out that form? Got to train people on how to do that. Here's the who asked about the equipment. Here's the list. The different vendors I have found in talking with OSHA, talking with my consultant with AGC. These are other companies that provide that equipment. I'm happy to talk to you about any of those. Looks like we're going to probably use ISC.
And so what is it called again?
Atmospheric, what's it called?
Four-way
Gas
gas
monitor.
Four-way
Gas monitor. But it's atmospheric testing of those 4 gases. Generally, excuse me, if you Google 4-gas monitor, you'll find it. So those are some resources for that. And then again, as I mentioned, what I see coming for me next is educating our trade contractors about these regulations and their responsibilities if they're going to do the hazard assessment. Okay, so to review, I just provided our program to give you a sense of what you can do. I'm happy to share that. You need to come up with what's going to work for your company, of course, and streamline it to fit. We're a large company. We have large exposure, large crews. We're going to do things differently than you might do if you've only got one crew. But I hope that some of this has helped with giving you ideas on how to create your own program. Training is critical. Establishing your own policy and procedures. Then you've got to choose the equipment. More training on that equipment once you get it. And then really I see this as a process of iteration, trial and error. You're going to put this process into place and then you're going to revise it. Questions? Yes?
How do you handle training your crew? What steps do you take? Do you call them in? Do you go out to the job site? Do you talk? Do you show videos? What do you do?
What I've done so far is brought them in for training. What I see down the road is periodically it may be going out. What I've told some people is when you start doing this, if you want me to come out, I'll come out to the job site. But right now I've done it, bringing them in.
And then do you just...
I do the training.
Talk to them?
Yep. Other questions? I have a question for Dave. So Dave, from what you see of this, does this meet the regulations?
Yeah, I actually am of a different opinion than you, that I don't know that you're always going to be dealing with the permit space. I don't see that as being a rare thing necessarily, especially once you do that initial assessment and you say you do your initial assessment, you don't find any atmospheric hazards, and you don't see anything else that's going to cause one, you're pretty much done.
So, for those of you online, Dave said, you've done the assessment, you don't find any hazards, you're pretty much done. Dave, from reading the regulations, and this is the publication that Dave was referring to that they've created at Oregon OSHA, really good publication. It seemed like you still needed to document that information.
Not necessarily, but
Okay.
It's a phenomenally good idea, especially if you have multiple people from multiple places going into that same space, so that everyone's on the same page, that you know that they know this has been done.
Yes, yes.
So I mean, I'm hugely in favor of it, but it's not strictly absolutely required
So
to
again, if you
document
couldn't
your
hear,
initial size up.
what I've shown you isn't strictly required, but from my interpretation and Dave is in support of, in terms of the risk and the liability and the responsibility, it's a good idea to have such documentation posted at the entry to these confined spaces. Yes?
I had a question. So, I mean, technically every attic could be a fall hazard
Yes,
because you can go right through that drywall.
that is correct.
Are you treating attics over two-story falls differently than attics over one-story falls?
No. The question was, are we treating attics, all attics have fall risk? Dave?
We specifically exempted this. If the only hazard is a fall hazard, we specifically exempted that from the confined space requirements because we have a whole other rule that talks specifically about fall hazards.
Okay.
Now, if there are other hazards that exist along with the fall hazard, then you would still have to address it via the permit or alternate entry process. Although with alternate entry, if you're able to eliminate the other, let's say you have an open electrical box, and you go down and you lock it out at the fuse box. You've eliminated that hazard. You can still use alternate entry, even though you technically can't eliminate a fall hazard. But you're going to use the fall protection rules, and you can still use alternate entry under those circumstances.
So again, if the only hazard is fall, as I understand it from Dave, then you're not in a permit or alternate entry requirement.
Correct. But
Thanks, Brad. And it doesn't, it's over 6 feet is the fall protection requirement. So any one story or two, you're over that limit. Other questions?
In that particular case, then it's only a good idea to have documentation but not requirements. So if we don't have it on the file, nothing will happen. It's just a recommendation.
That's a question for Dave.
Right. So, if the compliance officer comes a calling,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to ask you questions about how does your process work, and depending on how complex your system is, how many people you have, how many moving parts there are, if you don't have anything in writing, we're going to be asking not only you, but the people and all the folks involved. And if we ask 5 people the same question and we get 8 different answers, we know there's a problem. If you have it documented, then at least you have, you can demonstrate and you make sure that everyone is on that same page. Then it's a much, much, much better chance that we're going to get the same answer from everybody. And not only are we going to be happy, but you know that your folks are adequately protected because they're doing the thing you think that they're doing.
I had one question.
Before, Ryan,
okay.
excuse me, before you ask your audience online if they could hear that question and answer. I don't know if that picks
The
up back
mics
there.
are really good.
Oh, they are?
Oh, yeah.
Good. Okay, thank you. Yes, Ryan.
My question was this, and this was earlier when I saw the standard form that you had created, and your willingness to share that with everyone. The question that I had is, would it be of value to, standardize this form and have it as a part of documentation within threshold for everyone, so that it meets those goals and objectives for people if you are running into a case where you need to go through the assessment, you have access to that. So if that's of value to folks, we could work towards adding that to the standardized documents that you have available to you. So please let me know if we could add any value or support you all in that way too. So
You know what would be really helpful is when you put together the send out slides or whatever you send out with this, if you could send an attachment to your form. That's great that you've done that. Thank you for sharing that. I really
I can work with Lisa
Yeah.
on that stuff. So yeah.
Anything else?
So,
Oh, more questions?
Go ahead,
Yes,
George.
Sean.
So what happened when you find a electrical box with the open blocks and all the wires and everything, and the homeowner just says, I don't have money to improve that fix. What do you do?
Well, you have 2 choices. So the question is, if you find an open electrical box or many in an attic, we've often found many, what do you do? As the responsible employer, you first ask, like you said, you ask the homeowner to fix it. If they can't afford it, you have an ethical choice. Do you go ahead and do that and kind of ignore the regulations for confined spaces? Or do you simply walk away from that job and say, homeowner, if you can't repair that for the safety of our employees, I can't work on this job?
Now, if you can lock it out, you can still use the alternate entry process.
So if you can
So
turn off
there's
the
a
power.
third option. So what I heard, and I didn't understand that either, so what I heard is if you've got an attic full of open junction boxes, homeowner doesn't want to fix them, then if you lock out and tag out, as I understand the regulations, if you turn off all the power to that space, all those electrical boxes, then you could go in under alternate entry.
Absolutely, because you've locked it out, you've temporarily eliminated that hazard.
So that's a great alternative. I'm glad you asked that question.
So breakers off, panels locked, and then we could baffle around the electrical and then not insure.
Right, because basically it's dead. Now, lockout, tag out, or controlled hazardous energy always has 3 components. You lock it, you tag it, and then you test it. So it's lock, tag, and try. So that's what did you do? How do you know that worked? Always, always, always. So if there's multiple sources inside that attic and you don't know if that they're all on the same circuit, you could go funny and just turn everything off. That's still acceptable because that's how you know, because the main power is now off. The homeowner may be grumpy about it.
Right.
But absent an electrician telling you which circuits that are actually up there, that may be your only alternative. Other than, to be able to do that work, as opposed to saying, sorry, we're backing out.
And just for the form, it's just like when you are doing the job or the work, it's like you have to do like we turn off the panel, everything lock at, and then we do the job and after that.
Yep.
That's
So documenting that process. Yeah, Sean, you had a question.
And I don't know if this is going to fall under a confined space kind of hazard or not, but one thing we've run into in the field a lot more are structural issues. Especially when you're getting into basements and crawl spaces with a lot of water damage, and especially in older homes from the early parts of the century, you have a lot of unsecured beams and supports, and a lot of times those are rotten. So if you bump one of those, is a house going to come down on top of you or a floor? There's been a few projects where we've had to kind of back out a little bit and say, okay, we need to have an engineer come in here and take a look at this and see what kind of shoring or other work needs to be done before we can safely work under there.
Right. That sounds like the candidate for the potential permit space, wouldn't you say? Where if you can't eliminate, of course you wouldn't want to go under there either if it wasn't that weak.
That's
Yes,
what
Dave.
Well, I'd say that this is a great candidate for that last box, other.
Yeah, the other.
So that's the thing with confined spaces. You don't want to go in with a checklist that only tells you to check for 5 things because life always throws at least 8 at you.
Yeah.
So being able to identify those hazards and do that evaluation. Once you've identified, and that can be something that you don't know about until you get to it. That does not mean that at that point, up until that point, that you were in violation because you had no way of knowing. Now, once you've identified it, you back away slowly, so as not to make things worse, and then you reevaluate. Now, if it does take in, if it has something that's going to keep it up, that's basically temporarily eliminating that hazard because you have that means in that. If there's a failure, it's still going to be safe. But if there's no way of doing that, that's not necessarily a permit space hazard because even when you go in under a permit mode, you still have to do something about that hazard, even if it's just controlling it. So if you can't control it, then you don't go in. So like if you have an explosive atmosphere, you don't go in anyway because there's no control. There's nothing that you can do that can protect you from blowing up. You have to do something else.
And Dave, that reminds me, we didn't talk about it. It goes back to the equipment that we've always been using by BPI standards and our professional requirements for home performance, that we've used gas detectors. So that's testing right along the line, but what the new regulations require is that you're testing that atmosphere. So that's the difference, and that's why BPI doesn't fully make us compliant with the new confined spaces regulations. Any other questions?
for equipment like these are the cooling. So is it required by OSHA to wear one of those, or is it something like just we can implement that is not required by OSHA? Just you have to be in the attic and just really add up there or something. Could be maybe another procedure. It says that maybe the guys working in cycles like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, get out, get fresh. I go in, something like that. Does that work?
It can. When we look at anytime we look at a hazard, the way of dealing with that is we follow what's called a hierarchy of controls. And for safety people, this is kind of ingrained and beaten into our heads from an early age. So the hierarchy of controls is from the most, where do you want to start in looking at how you're going to deal with that hazard. So the first one is, can you eliminate it? Do you even have to do this thing in the first place? So a great example of that, I knew a guy who worked for McDonnell Douglas. When they were making airplanes, they used PVC pipes that were white that they put all their wires in, and then they come along and paint it black. Well, that created a new hazard. And he said, why don't you just use black PVC pipe? And they said, oh yeah. They've eliminated the hazard completely. That's always first choice. Next choice is engineering controls. Or actually, next choice is isolating it from everything else. After that, engineering controls. After that, administrative controls, which is where you have specific, you only work in there for X amount of time.
Scheduling.
The very last choice is personal protective equipment. The reason why personal protective equipment is always the very last choice is because it is always the very first to fail. Because it relies on a person being 100% perfect 100% of the time. And ain't no one on this planet that meets that. Not even in North Korea.
Not even.
Regardless of what they say.
I just want to wrap up by saying thanks for your time, and I want to thank Dave as well. He's been a great resource in this whole process, and they continue to be, as if you haven't already heard, OSHA, if you ask them to consult, they're a great resource, and the people who consult can't nail you for compliancy issues. So it's a separate role and responsibilities, great resource to you, along with the others I've listed here.
I want to thank both of you for being here today. I will be kind of slicing and dicing and cutting the audio and video up and distributing it to everyone following the session ending here. And so, greatly appreciate both your time and your expertise. So thank you. And thanks everyone online. Hope you all have a great day.